There comes a moment in life when the noise stops, when the messages fade, the calls disappear, and the connection you once held in your hands slips into silence. And in that silence, most people panic. But this is where the truth begins. When you and the avoidant both stop contacting, something profound happens. Not on the surface, but underneath. Because what you're witnessing is not the end of a connection, you're witnessing the removal of distraction. And without distraction, reality speaks. You see, most relationships are not built on connection, they're built on patterns. One chases, the other withdraws. One reaches, the other resists. It's a dance, predictable, exhausting, and unconscious. But when both of you stop, the dance collapses. And now there is space. Space to feel, space to think, space to confront what has always been there but avoided. For you, this silence can feel like loss, like uncertainty, like standing in the middle of a storm without direction. But I want you to understand something deeper. This is not punishment. This is alignment. Because when external validation disappears, internal truth rises. And here's where it gets shocking. The avoidant, the one who always needed distance, now experiences something unfamiliar. Not pressure, not pursuit, but absence. And absence has a strange power. It removes their ability to define the connection on their terms. Now they must face themselves. And human beings, no matter how distant they seem, are wired for connection. When the usual pattern breaks, the nervous system begins to question. Why is it quiet? Why aren't they chasing? Have I lost something real? And in that questioning, awareness begins. But listen carefully, this is not about them. This is about you. Because the greatest transformation doesn't happen when someone comes back. It happens when you no longer need them to. When you sit in that silence and instead of reacting, you evolve, everything changes. You start to see your own patterns. You start to reclaim your energy. You stop negotiating your worth for attention. And that is power. Not control over another person, but mastery over yourself. Because divine principles teach us something timeless. What is meant for you will not require you to abandon yourself to receive it. So while the silence feels uncertain, it is actually sacred. It is clearing space for truth. Either the connection rebuilds from a place of awareness, or it dissolves to make room for something aligned. But in both outcomes you win, because you are no longer operating from fear, but from clarity. And clarity is freedom. So don't fear the silence. Use it. Grow in it. Transform through it. Because what happens next isn't shocking because they return. It's shocking because you've changed so much, you no longer wait the same way. And that shift, that's where your real power begins. Silence has a way of stripping everything down to what is real. When the communication stops, when there are no messages to check, no calls to anticipate, no subtle signals to decode, something powerful begins to unfold within you. What once distracted you is no longer there, and in its absence, you are left with something far more confronting: your own thoughts, your own emotions, your own truth. Most people don't realize how much noise they rely on to avoid themselves. Every text, every interaction, every moment of engagement becomes a way to regulate emotion, to seek reassurance, to maintain a sense of control. But when that disappears, the mind can no longer escape inward reflection. And this is where silence becomes a mirror. It reflects not what you wish things were, but what they actually are. You begin to notice the patterns you couldn't see before. The moments you overgave, the times you ignored your own needs, the ways you may have held on tighter when you felt distance, or the ways you may have abandoned yourself just to maintain connection. These realizations don't come from outside validation, they come from within, because now there is nothing left to distract you from them. And this mirror doesn't just show pain, it shows desire. It reveals what you truly wanted from the connection. Was it security? Was it validation? Was it genuine partnership? In the absence of interaction, your emotional dependency, if there was any, becomes visible. Not to shame you, but to awaken you. Because awareness is the beginning of transformation. At the same time, silence exposes the emotional habits that were once hidden beneath constant interaction. You start to feel things more intensely not because they are new, but because they were previously diluted by communication. Every unanswered question now echoes louder. Every unresolved feeling now demands attention. And while this can feel uncomfortable, even overwhelming, it is also incredibly clarifying. You are no longer reacting, you are observing. And in observation, you gain power, because when you see clearly, you can choose differently. This is where many people face a critical moment. They can either try to escape the silence and reach out impulsively, seek distraction elsewhere, fill the void with something temporary, or they can stay present and allow the mirror to do its work. Staying present is not easy. It requires courage. It requires emotional honesty. It asks you to sit with uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. But in doing so, you begin to separate what is real from what is conditioned. You begin to understand that not every feeling requires action. Not every silence requires filling. Not every absence is a loss. Sometimes it is a revelation, because in that stillness, you start to reconnect with yourself in a way that constant interaction never allowed. You hear your own voice more clearly. You recognize your own value without needing it to be reflected back to you. You start to rebuild a sense of self that is not dependent on someone else's presence or response. And that changes everything. Because once you see yourself clearly, you can no longer unknow what you've discovered. The mirror has shown you not only your wounds, but your strength. Not only your fears, but your capacity to rise above them. Silence, then, is no longer empty. It becomes a space of awakening, a space where illusions fall away, and truth stands still, waiting to be acknowledged. When both people stop reaching out, something subtle but powerful shifts beneath the surface. The entire emotional dynamic resets. What once felt like a push and pull, a constant imbalance of energy, suddenly loses its structure. No one is leaning forward, no one is pulling away. And in that moment, the invisible tension that once defined the connection begins to dissolve. In most situations like this, there is an unspoken imbalance. One person invests more, initiates more, feels more urgency. The other maintains distance, controls the pace, responds rather than pursues. This creates a dynamic where power, not shared, is tilted. Not because one person is better, but because one is more emotionally available than the other. But when both stop contacting, that imbalance can no longer sustain itself. The roles that once felt fixed begin to blur. The one who used to chase is no longer chasing. The one who used to withdraw is no longer being pursued. And without these roles in motion, the entire system resets to zero. It's like a scale that has been uneven for so long, suddenly finding its center. Gun. This is where things become interesting, because power in human connection is often misunderstood. People think power comes from control over another person, who's texts first, whose cares less, whose holds emotional leverage. But true power is not about control, it is about stability within yourself. And when the dynamic resets, both individuals are forced into that space of self-reliance. There is no longer an external source regulating emotions. No reassurance coming in. No tension to react to. And because of that, each person must face their own internal state without influence from the other. For the one who was always reaching out, this can feel like reclaiming energy. The constant need to initiate, to check in, to hold the connection together, it disappears. And in that absence, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel your own ground again. You start to realize how much effort you were giving, how much of your emotional world was tied to someone else's responses. And as that realization deepens, so does your sense of autonomy. You begin to understand that you were never powerless, who were just overinvested. At the same time, for the one who maintained distance, the reset removes a different kind of structure. They are no longer responding to someone else's energy. There is no incoming attention to manage, no expectation to resist. And without that, the sense of control they once had begins to fade. Because control only exists in relation to something. When there is nothing to respond to, nothing to avoid, the illusion of control disappears, and what remains is something far more honest. Their own feelings, unfiltered and uninterrupted. This is where neutrality becomes powerful. Because neutrality is not indifference, it is balance. It is a space where neither person is trying to influence the other, where emotional reactions are no longer dictating behavior. And in this space, clarity begins to emerge. Not forced clarity, not rushed conclusions, but a natural understanding that comes from stillness. You start to see the connection for what it was, not just how it felt in moments of intensity. You begin to recognize patterns without being caught in them. And most importantly, you begin to detach your sense of self from the outcome. That is the real shift, because when the power dynamic resets, the need to win, to prove, to hold on, it starts to fade, and what replaces it is a deeper awareness of what is actually aligned and what is not. From this place, any future interaction, if it happens, will not be driven by imbalance, but by choice. And choice, when it comes from clarity rather than emotion, carries a completely different kind of power. Distance does not affect everyone the same way, and this is where many people misunderstand what silence truly does to someone who is avoidant. On the surface, it may seem like they are unaffected, as if space is exactly what they always wanted, but internally something much more complex begins to unfold, something that often goes unnoticed. When contact stops completely, the avoidant no longer experiences pressure. There are no expectations to respond, no emotional intensity to manage, no perceived demands on their independence. At first, this can feel like relief. Their nervous system settles. The need to create distance disappears because distance is already there. But here's where the shift begins. Avoidant individuals are not disconnected from emotion, they are protective of it. Their patterns are not about a lack of feeling, but about managing feelings that at some point in their life felt overwhelming or unsafe. So when the usual dynamic is in place, when someone is reaching out wanting more closeness, they instinctively move away to regulate themselves. However, when that pursuit disappears entirely, something unexpected happens. There is nothing left to push against. And without that resistance, their internal world becomes quieter but also more noticeable. Absence of contact removes external stimulation, which means their attention begins to turn inward. Thoughts that were once buried under distraction start to rise. Memories surface. Moments replay. Not because they are forced to, but because the mind naturally seeks resolution when there is unfinished emotional business. This is where curiosity begins. They may start to wonder why the silence feels different this time. Why there is a subtle awareness of absence rather than just comfort in space. They might notice the lack of messages not as relief but as something unfamiliar, something that interrupts their usual pattern. And curiosity is powerful because it opens a door that avoidance usually keeps closed. Instead of reacting, they begin to reflect. They might think about the connection in a way they didn't before, not in moments of intensity, but in moments of calm. They start to see not just what felt overwhelming, but also what felt meaningful. And because there is no longer pressure attached to these thoughts, they can sit with them without immediately needing to escape. This is where something deeper can emerge: longing. Not always dramatic, not always obvious, but subtle and persistent. A sense of missing something they didn't fully acknowledge when it was present. Because when something is constantly available, it's easy to take it for granted or to focus only on the parts that feel uncomfortable. But when it's gone, perception shifts. The mind begins to balance. The narrative. They may recall the ease, the connection, the moments of understanding. And without the immediate trigger of closeness to activate their defenses, they can experience these memories without the same level of discomfort. This creates an internal conflict. Part of them still values space and independence, but another part begins to recognize the absence of connection. And for someone who is used to managing distance, this dual awareness can feel disorienting. Because now, distance is no longer something they are controlling, it is something they are experiencing. And that difference matters. When they were the ones creating space, it felt safe. It felt intentional. But when space exists without their control, it can feel uncertain. It raises questions they are not used to asking. Is this over? Did I lose something important? Do I actually miss them? These questions don't always lead to action, but they do lead to awareness. And awareness, even in small amounts, can begin to soften rigid patterns over time. Not because someone else is pushing them to change, but because the experience itself is shifting their perspective. Distance then becomes more than just absence. It becomes a quiet invitation, one that allows them to feel without pressure, to reflect without resistance, and to slowly confront parts of themselves that were once hidden behind the need for space. When communication stops, something deeper than silence takes over. It becomes a crossroads. Not an obvious one, not a dramatic turning point you can see from the outside, but an internal fork in the road where each person is faced with a choice. And that choice is rarely conscious. It unfolds through behavior, through thought patterns, through what you do with the space you've been given. Because when there is no contact, no external interaction shaping your emotional state, you are left with raw material: your habits, your coping mechanisms, your beliefs about connection. And from this place, one of two things begins to happen. You either grow or you escape. Growth doesn't announce itself loudly. It often begins in discomfort. You start to notice feelings you didn't fully process before, maybe anxiety, maybe longing, maybe even a sense of emptiness. But instead of immediately trying to fix or avoid those feelings, you sit with them. You observe them. You ask questions that most people don't ask. Why do I feel this way? What was I seeking in this connection? Where did I ignore myself? This kind of reflection requires honesty. It asks you to take responsibility for your emotional patterns. Not in a way that blames you, but in a way that empowers you. Because once you see your patterns, you are no longer controlled by them. And this is where real growth begins. You start making subtle shifts. You stop idealizing the past and begin seeing it clearly. You recognize what was aligned and what wasn't. You understand your own needs at a deeper level, and instead of suppressing them to maintain connection, you begin to honor them. You become more grounded, more aware, more intentional. And over time, this inner work reshapes how you show up, not just in this situation, but in every relationship that follows. But there's another path, and it's one that many people take without realizing it: escape. Instead of facing the discomfort of silence, the mind looks for ways to avoid it. Distractions become more appealing. You might find yourself constantly checking your phone, hoping for a message. Or you might swing in the opposite direction, trying to fill the void with new connections, new conversations, anything that keeps you from sitting alone with your thoughts. Escape can also be mental. Replaying scenarios, overanalyzing every detail, creating stories about what the other person is thinking or feeling. These thought loops give the illusion of processing, but they don't lead to clarity, they lead to confusion. Because they are not rooted in truth, they are rooted in fear. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of being alone. And when fear drives your internal world, growth cannot take place. Instead, patterns become reinforced. If you are someone who depended heavily on external validation, escape keeps you dependent. If you are someone who avoided emotional depth, escape allows you to continue avoiding. Nothing changes, only the circumstances do. And this is the real difference between growth and escape. Growth transforms your relationship with yourself. Escape preserves it exactly as it is. What makes this moment so powerful is that both paths are available at the same time. The silence doesn't force you to grow, and it doesn't force you to escape. It simply reveals which direction you are already leaning toward. And once you recognize that, you have a choice. You can continue reacting in ways that feel familiar but keep you stuck, or you can lean into the discomfort, knowing that on the other side of it is a version of you that is more aware, more secure, and more aligned with what you truly need. The silence then is not empty. It is active. It is shaping you depending on how you respond to it. And whether that shaping leads to evolution or repetition is entirely determined by what you choose to do within it. When there is no contact, no interaction to focus on, something deeper begins to rise: or attachment patterns. These patterns are not random behaviors, they are emotional blueprints shaped over time, often rooted in early experiences of connection, safety, and loss. And most of the time they operate quietly in the background, influencing how you act without you fully realizing it. But silence brings them to the surface. Without communication to stabilize or distract you, your internal world becomes louder. If you have any fear of abandonment, it begins to speak. You might notice thoughts like, what if they never come back? Or was I not enough? These thoughts aren't just about the current situation, they are echoes of something deeper, something that existed long before this connection. At the same time, if there is a fear of intimacy, it also begins to reveal itself, but in a different way. Instead of anxiety about losing the connection, there may be a sense of relief in the distance, a feeling of safety in the absence of emotional closeness. But even that relief can carry an underlying tension because it often comes at the cost of something meaningful. This is the paradox of attachment patterns. They are designed to protect you, but they often keep you stuck, and silence exposes this clearly. Because now, there is no interaction to justify your feelings, no behavior from the other person to point to as the cause. What you feel arises from within, and that makes it harder to ignore. If you tend toward anxious attachment, the silence can feel overwhelming. The lack of response creates uncertainty, and uncertainty triggers the need for reassurance. You may feel an urge to reach out, to restore connection, to reduce the discomfort as quickly as possible. Not because it is the best choice, but because it temporarily soothes the fear. But if you pause and observe, you begin to see the pattern. You realize that the intensity you feel is not just about this person, it is about what their absence represents. The possibility of being left, of being unseen, of not being chosen. And once you see that, you have an opportunity to respond differently. Instead of reacting impulsively, you can begin to regulate those emotions from within. You can remind yourself that your worth is not determined by someone else's presence. You can create stability internally rather than seeking it externally. On the other hand, if you lean toward avoidance, silence might initially feel comfortable. There is no pressure to engage, no emotional demand to meet. But over time, something else can emerge, a subtle awareness of disconnection. Because while avoidance protects you from vulnerability, it also limits your ability to experience closeness. And in the absence of contact, that limitation becomes more visible. You might start to notice that while distance feels safe, it also feels empty. That by keeping emotions at arm's length, you are also keeping meaning at a distance. And this realization can be unsettling, because it challenges the very strategy that once felt protective. This is where awareness becomes transformative. Because once your attachment patterns are exposed, they are no longer automatic. You can see them as patterns rather than as truth. You can recognize when fear is driving your thoughts instead of reality. And in that recognition, you gain a choice. You can continue to operate from those patterns, allowing them to dictate your reactions. Or you can begin to shift them slowly, intentionally, by choosing responses that align with who you want to become rather than what you've been conditioned to do. Silence then becomes more than just a pause in communication. It becomes a lens, a way of seeing yourself more clearly than you could when you were caught in the constant flow of interaction. And what it reveals is not always comfortable, but it is always valuable. Because understanding your attachment patterns is the first step toward changing them. And once you begin to change them, the way you experience connection itself starts to transform. Thank you for taking the time to reflect, grow, and invest in your own understanding. It truly matters. Goodbye for now, and may your journey ahead be guided by clarity, strength, and self-respect.